The morning Margaret Calloway received the letter, she was standing at the kitchen sink in bare feet, watching her daughter pick at a bowl of cereal that had gone soft. The girl was 7, and she had a habit of doing that, stirring and stirring until the milk turned beige, until breakfast became something that had to be encouraged rather than enjoyed. Maggie did not say anything. She dried her hands on the dish towel, looped through the oven handle, and looked at the envelope she had already opened once and set face down on the counter, as if putting it out of sight might change what it said. It did not change. She turned it back over and read it again, the same way she had the first time, slowly and with the particular focus of someone who expected the words to rearrange themselves into something more manageable. It did not do that either. The letter was from an attorney in a town called Calverton, 230 miles south, a place Maggie had not visited in over a decade. It stated, in the measured language of legal correspondence, that her great-uncle Roland Pierce had passed away 6 weeks prior and that, pursuant to the terms of his estate, Margaret and Calloway was the sole beneficiary of a parcel of land located in Sutter County, approximately 60 acres in total. The property had no outstanding mortgage. The taxes were current. A deed would be transferred upon her signature. Maggie set the letter down and looked at her daughter again. "Eat," she said gently. Her daughter stirred the cereal again without looking up. The name Roland Pierce meant something to Maggie in the vague, sepia-toned way that distant relatives existed in the memory of people whose families did not gather often. She remembered him from a single visit when she was 9 or 10, a quiet man with sun-darkened skin who had come to a funeral in a dark suit that was too short in the sleeves. He had shaken her hand instead of hugging her, which had struck her as strange at the time, and had spoken to her father in low voices near the back of the church. She did not know what they had discussed. After that, his name appeared occasionally in oblique holiday references, usually followed by a pause, the kind of pause adults used when a topic was present but not quite welcome. She had not known he was still alive until the letter told her he was not. The second letter arrived 3 days later. This one was less formal, handwritten on plain paper by the attorney himself, rather than printed through a firm letterhead. He explained that he had been representing Roland Pierce for the better part of 30 years, and that the old man had been particular about certain things. One of them was that the land go to someone in the family who, in Roland's words, had enough trouble in her life not to be picky about what came her way. The attorney's tone was not unkind. He had added a handwritten note at the bottom. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Calloway. It isn't much to look at, but it's yours free and clear." Maggie folded both letters and put them in the drawer beside the unpaid electric bill and the notice from her son's school about overdue lunch fees. She made herself a second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and thought about her life for a long time. Her son was 9. His name was Eli, and he was the kind of child who woke up already planning things, already full of questions that ran ahead of their answers. Her daughter, B, was quieter and more watchful, the kind of child who collected details without announcing them. Maggie had raised both of them largely on her own for the past 4 years, since their father had moved to another state and then another, and then simply ceased being a consistent presence in any practical sense. He sent money sometimes, enough to fill a gap, but never enough to close one. Maggie worked 2 jobs, one in a title company downtown, where she processed paperwork for other people's property transfers with a patience she had earned through necessity, and one 3 evenings a week at a restaurant near the university where she refilled water glasses and carried plates, and came home with her feet aching and her uniform smelling of grease. She was not in crisis, which is to say that the lights were on and the rent was mostly paid and the children had what they needed within the definition of need that had been quietly revised over the years. But she was tired in a way that went beyond sleep. She was tired in the way that people get when they have been running at full capacity for so long, that full capacity no longer feels like effort. It just feels like the baseline of existing. She was 34 years old, and she looked it in the mirror in the morning without apology, but sometimes late at night when the house was quiet, she allowed herself the admission that this was not the shape she had imagined her life taking. She did not complain about it. That was important to her, the not complaining. Her mother had been a complainer, artful and consistent, and Maggie had grown up in the weather of that and resolved, young, to be different. So she did not complain. She adjusted. She recalculated. She absorbed the shortfalls and kept moving, which was a form of strength, but also, if she was honest with herself, a form of not stopping long enough to feel how heavy the weight had become. The 60 acres sat in her mind all week like a question without a context. She called her sister, Diane, on a Thursday evening. Diane lived in Phoenix and had married a man who worked in commercial real estate and who had strong opinions about most things, including other people's financial decisions. Maggie had learned over the years to present information to Diane carefully, which was another way of saying that she had learned to brace herself. Roland's land, Diane said, repeating the words with a specific kind of flatness that communicated more than tone. In Sutter County. That's what the letter says. Maggie, that is swampland. Diane said it the way someone says the punchline of a joke they have told before. I remember Dad talking about it. Roland bought it for almost nothing in the 70s, and everyone thought he'd lost his mind. There is nothing down there but mosquitoes and mud. It's 60 acres, Maggie said. Of swamp, Diane said. Free and clear isn't the same as valuable. Free and clear of swamp is still a swamp. You'd be responsible for the property taxes every year, the liability insurance, the maintenance. What are you going to do with 60 acres of standing water and cypress trees? Maggie did not have an answer to that. She also noticed that Diane had not asked how she was doing, which was typical and not surprising, but still landed somewhere in the middle of her chest with a familiar, small weight. I just wanted to tell you, Maggie said. I'm telling you to be practical, Diane said. You can try to sell it, but you won't get much. Swampland in Sutter County isn't exactly what buyers are lining up for. The call with her mother was shorter and more pointed. Her mother said that Roland had always been peculiar, and that this was exactly the kind of thing peculiar people did, left their peculiarities to other people to manage. She said 60 acres of swamp was more of a burden than a blessing, which was a phrase she enjoyed and deployed broadly. She said she hoped Maggie wasn't going to do something foolish with it. Maggie thanked her for the concern and said she hadn't decided anything yet. She had not talked to her coworker Priya about it. Not at first, but Priya had a way of noticing when something was circling in Maggie's head, and one afternoon during a slow stretch at the title company, she asked directly what was wrong. Maggie showed her the letter. Priya read it twice, the way Maggie had, and then looked up with an expression that was harder to read than Diane's had been. Have you looked it up? Priya asked. Maggie had not. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the small desk in her bedroom with her laptop and typed in the parcel number from the attorney's letter. The county assessor's records pulled up with the blunt efficiency of a government database. The land was classified as wetland and timber property. The assessed value was low enough to make her exhale sharply, not in disappointment exactly, more in the quiet confirmation of something she had already suspected. It was bordered on the east by a county road and on the other three sides by land that had once been agricultural but showed in the satellite images as gone fallow, taken back by brush and standing water. She studied the aerial photographs for a long time. The land was not dramatic from above. It was green in the way that things are green when they are wet and dense and undisturbed, a deep, heavy green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were stands of trees she could not name from the images alone, their canopies spreading over dark water that in some photographs looked still as glass, and in others looked pale and silvered where it caught the angle of the sun. A narrow track ran from the county road into the property and disappeared after a short distance into the tree cover, barely visible beneath the overgrowth. She closed the laptop at 11 and lay awake for an hour thinking about nothing in particular, which was the way she thought about important things. 2 weeks later, she signed the transfer documents and drove south. She had arranged for her neighbor Mrs. Fontaine to watch the children for the weekend, and she had packed a bag with clothes suitable for wet ground and a pair of rubber boots she had borrowed from Priya, who was taller than her by 3 inches and whose boots therefore fit with the addition of 2 pairs of heavy socks. She had a printed copy of the directions from the attorney, who had also sent a hand-drawn map of the property boundary with a note that the main gate was held shut by a chain, but not locked, that she should push rather than pull, and that she was welcome to call him if she needed anything. The drive south took her through country she had not seen in years. The city gave way to its outer rings, and then to the stretched-out miles of smaller towns, and then to the kind of landscape that did not announce itself, just arrived. The land on either side of the highway shifted gradually, the colors changing, the vegetation thickening, the sky widening as the commercial corridors fell behind, and the fields and tree lines took over. By the time she crossed into Sutter County, the humidity had changed the quality of the air in a way she could feel through the car windows even before she lowered them. She found the county road named on the documents, turned onto it, and drove slowly. The road was paved but narrow, the edges soft with encroaching grass. She counted the mile markers and found the gate where the attorney had described it, a plain galvanized gate between two wooden posts that had long since stopped standing perfectly upright. The chain was wrapped twice, a fat old padlock hanging open through one of the links. She pushed the gate the way he had said, and it moved with a long, reluctant groan, dragging a curved path through the grass. Maggie parked on the inside of the gate and stood beside her car for a moment. The air was warmer than it had been 200 miles north, with a weight to it that was not unpleasant, just present. She could hear insects, the low, steady drone of them at a distance, and somewhere through the trees a bird calling in a pattern she did not recognize. The track ahead of her was two shallow ruts with a raised center of grass, the kind of path made not by design, but by the repeated passage of a single vehicle over years. On either side, the vegetation rose quickly, not wild exactly, but uncurated, growing according to its own priorities. She put on Priya's boots and walked. The track ran roughly straight for about 200 feet before bending left around a stand of water oaks whose roots had buckled the ground into low ridges. After the bend, the land opened slightly, the tree canopy thinning enough to let in more of the afternoon sky. Here the track divided. One branch continued forward and eventually vanished into the heavier growth. The other turned toward a small rise in the ground where the remains of a structure were visible through the brush, walls of weathered wood planking, a roof that had partially collapsed, a door frame that still held its shape but no longer held a door. She walked toward it. The structure had been a cabin or a small storage building. She could not determine which. The interior was dim and smelled of old wood and something faintly sweet that she could not identify. Leaves had accumulated on the floor over years, composting slowly against the baseboards. A metal shelf unit stood against one wall, its surface furred with rust, holding the remains of a few glass jars whose lids had long since failed. The light came through gaps in the planking in thin lines, striping the floor. Maggie stood in the middle of the space and turned slowly, looking at each wall, reading the details the way she had learned to read documents of the title company, looking for what was present rather than what was expected. There was not much to find. The building had been empty for a long time. Whatever purpose it had served had concluded well before she or Roland had thought to consider it. She walked back to the track and continued forward. The land began to change about 300 feet in. The ground softened underfoot, the soil becoming darker and more yielding, the sound of her boots shifting from the dry compression of packed earth to something wetter and more deliberate. Water appeared in the low spots, shallow and dark, reflecting the sky in fragments. The roots of the trees rose from the ground in arched forms, knees breaking the surface at angles, and the plants around them grew in the dense, layered way of things that had found a system and stuck with it. Maggie walked carefully, testing the ground ahead with each step. The water in the low spots was shallow, no more than a few inches in most places, but its edges were uncertain, and she had learned in the first few minutes that what looked solid from a step away could compress and yield without warning. She kept to the higher ground where it existed, the gentle ridges between the wet areas, and moved along these the way water moved in the opposite direction, following the path of least resistance. The swamp, if that was the word for it, did not feel malevolent. That was the thing she had not expected, coming in with Diane's voice in her head. It felt old, and it felt private, and it felt entirely indifferent to her presence in the way that places do when they have been getting along without people for a long time and see no reason to change their arrangements. There were birds she could now see in addition to hearing, small and fast-moving through the understory, and once at the edge of her vision, something larger that was gone before she could determine what it was. The light through the canopy was green and layered, falling in pieces rather than all at once. She walked for about 40 minutes, stopping periodically to get her bearings against the sky, before she reached the far end of the property where the trees thinned and the county road was visible through a fence line of wire and old cedar posts. She turned and walked back along a different route, higher ground this time, moving along a natural levee that curved through the interior like a spine. From this elevation, modest as it was, the property resolved into something more comprehensible. The wet areas were arranged in rough bowls between the higher ridges, connected by the shallow movement of water that flowed, almost imperceptibly, from north to south. The tree cover was heaviest over the wetter ground and thinner along the ridges, where the soil was sandier and less saturated. She could see where water had once been higher, the stain lines on the lower trunks marking old water levels like a record kept in bark. She drove back to the town of Calverton that afternoon and met the attorney, whose name was Harold Fitch, at his office above a hardware store on the main street. He was older than she had expected, somewhere in his mid-70s, with a careful way of speaking that suggested a man who chose his words the way others chose their clothing. His office was neat and full of natural light, and held the specific quietness of a room that has been organized over decades and not disrupted. He shook her hand and offered her coffee, and they sat across from each other at a wide desk while he walked her through the transfer documents. He answered her questions plainly, without condescension, which she appreciated. He told her that Roland had bought the land in 1974 for a price that would have bought a used car, that he had lived on the adjacent property at that time, and had used the swampland for trapping and hunting and what Fitch described, with a slight smile, as general solitude. He had sold the adjacent property in the 1990s and moved into town, and the swampland had simply sat. Did he ever say why he kept it? Maggie asked. Fitch considered this. He said it had value that wasn't visible yet, he replied. He said that about several times over the years. I took it for the sentiment of an old man who was attached to a place. Maybe it was that. Maybe it was something else. Maggie looked at the signed documents on the desk between them. Did he say anything about me? About why me specifically? Fitch nodded slowly. He said you were the one who would actually go there, he replied. He said the others would take one look and sell it, and that would be the end of it. He wanted someone who would stay long enough to understand it. Maggie drove back to the city on Sunday evening with the deed in her bag and Priya's boots in the trunk, still muddy. She arrived home after 10, paid Mrs. Fontaine, checked on the children, and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house before going to bed. She had not made any decisions. She was not yet sure what decisions there were to make. But something had settled in her on that drive north, something that was not yet a plan, but was beginning to resemble the outline of one. She told Diane about the visit on Monday. Diane listened and then said, "So it's really just swamp." And Maggie said yes, and Diane said she was sorry, which she did not mean as comfort, but as conclusion. Maggie thanked her and changed the subject. She told her mother as well, briefly, and her mother said that she had always thought Roland was keeping something up his sleeve, which was meant as criticism, but which Maggie filed away as something closer to a clue. She told no one at work except Priya, who cleaned the boots without being asked and handed them back and said, "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet," Maggie said. "But you're not going to sell it." Maggie thought about that. "No," she said, "not yet." Priya nodded, as if that was the answer she had expected. In the weeks that followed, Maggie drove down to Calverton 3 more times. She could not afford to make these trips in any strict financial sense, but she had decided quietly and without announcement that she was going to stop measuring things solely by what she could afford in the short term and start measuring them by what she might be able to build toward if she committed to something with her whole attention. That was a different calculation. It left her bank account in roughly the same condition, but produced a different sensation in her chest, something more like intention and less like endurance. Each visit, she walked the property more deliberately. She brought a notebook and a cheap compass and made rough sketches of the terrain, marking the high ground and the wet areas and the tree lines and the places where the water moved and the places where it pooled without apparent outlet. She noted where the soil changed in character, where the clay gave way to sand, where the tree species shifted from the moisture-tolerant varieties near the water to the scruffier, drier-ground trees along the ridges. She noted the sounds that changed throughout the day, which birds appeared at which hours, where the insects were loudest, which areas felt still, and which carried the faint evidence of movement beneath the surface. She was not sure what she was looking for. She was looking at the land in the way that Harold Fitch had described Roland looking at it, as a thing with value that had not yet decided to show itself. She was, she supposed, taking his instruction seriously in the absence of any clearer direction. On the third visit, she brought Eli and Bee. She had debated this and decided that the debate itself was instructive, that she had been debating it because she was afraid they would be unimpressed, which was another way of saying she was afraid she had made a mistake. She decided that bringing them was the only way to find out. Eli was delighted by the boots and the mud and the birds, and spent the first hour asking questions faster than she could answer them. He wanted to know the name of every tree, every sound, every insect he could see. Bee was quieter, but her eyes moved with that particular watchfulness she carried everywhere, absorbing the landscape with a patience unusual for a 7-year-old. At one point, while Maggie was checking her compass against the sketch in her notebook, Bee took her hand and pointed toward the water. "It's really still," Bee said. "Yes," Maggie said. "Like it's thinking," Bee said. Maggie looked at her daughter and felt something open in her chest, soft and unexpected. On the fourth visit, she brought a soil testing kit she had ordered online after watching 3 separate YouTube videos about wetland soil composition. The results were not dramatic. The soil was what she expected: high clay content, high organic matter, mildly acidic, consistent with the property's classification. She brought the results home and spread them on the desk next to the county assessor's map and the notes she had been accumulating, and looked at all of it together. There was a pattern in the data that she had started to notice but had not yet committed to in her mind. The high ground along the central ridge ran almost perfectly straight from north to south, unnaturally so for a natural landform. Natural ridges and wetlands curved and bent and followed the logic of water and sediment over centuries. This one was too straight. She had noticed it first on the satellite image and then confirmed it on foot. She had measured it, inexpertly but consistently, on 3 separate visits. The ridge was approximately 4 feet higher at its crest than the surrounding terrain, and it ran for nearly the full length of the property, from the area near the old cabin to the fence line at the southern edge. She did not know what to make of it yet. She set the thought aside and kept going. By this time, 6 weeks after signing the deed, word had gotten around in the way that word got around in the circles closest to her. Diane had mentioned it to their cousin Terrell, who had mentioned it at a Sunday dinner that Maggie had not attended. Her mother had told the women in her book club. A woman at the title company whose husband invested in rural property had heard and stopped by Maggie's desk to ask about it, with a particular kind of casual interest that was not casual at all. A neighbor, knowing she had inherited land, had suggested she contact a developer friend of his who specialized in, he said with a meaningful pause, distressed properties. Maggie understood all of these conversations for what they were. They were the version of the story being written about her in other people's heads, the story in which she was the working poor single mother who had been handed something she did not understand, and who would, if properly advised, make the sensible and immediate decision to sell it at whatever price the market offered and use the money to make rent for a few more months. It was a reasonable story. It had the advantage of being practical and the disadvantage of having already decided how it ended. She did not correct it openly. She was not the kind of person who corrected things openly. She just kept going to the property and kept making notes. Her brother-in-law, Gary, Diane's husband, called her one Saturday morning while she was making pancakes. He had heard, he said, that she was considering developing the land. She told him she was just doing some research. He said that 60 acres of Sutter County wetland had 0 development potential under current environmental protections, and that the maintenance costs alone would eat whatever small income she might imagine generating from it. That timber rights on low-grade swamp timber were minimal, that hunting leases in that area were worth something but not much, and that the honest assessment from his professional experience was that she should find a buyer and move on. He said all of this in the efficient, organized way of a man who believed that efficiency was kindness. Maggie thanked him for the information. After she hung up, she flipped 2 pancakes that had gone slightly past golden and slid them onto a plate for Eli anyway, and she thought about what Harold Fitch had said. He said it had value that wasn't visible yet. She was beginning to understand that people who had never walked the land were very confident about what it was. The summer that year was the beginning of something that none of the forecasts had quite predicted in the right terms. The Weather Service had been using the word drought for weeks by then, but drought in the coastal language of the forecast meant dry and inconvenient, not dry and fundamental. It meant water restrictions and brown lawns and certain crops running behind schedule. It did not yet mean what it was going to mean by late July, when the dry counties to the north began posting emergency declarations and the rivers that fed the groundwater tables across the lower part of the state dropped to levels that had not been recorded in decades. Maggie followed the weather in the abstract way that city people follow whether they are not yet directly living. She read about in the news while eating lunch at the title company, sympathetically and at a small remove. She thought about Calverton in passing, wondered how the property was faring. She had not been down in 3 weeks, the longest gap since she had taken ownership. It was Harold Fitch who called her. He was not an alarmist. She had gathered that from their limited acquaintance. So when she heard the particular measured quality of his voice, the way he spoke with slightly more precision than usual, she paid close attention. "You should come down soon," he said. "The water levels on the property are dropping quite a bit. I've been past the gate a few times. There's something happening on the land that you should see for yourself." "What kind of something?" Maggie asked. There was a pause of the sort she was starting to associate with Fitch, a pause that contained more information than the words on either side of it. "The kind that doesn't translate well over the phone," he said. "The kind that your great-uncle spent 50 years not talking about." Maggie looked at the calendar on her computer screen. She looked at the balance in her checking account. She looked at the stack of files on her desk. "I'll come this weekend," she said. The drive down that Friday evening was quiet. Eli was at a friend's house, and Bea was with Mrs. Fontaine, and Maggie had the car to herself for the first time in what felt like months. The radio played for a while, and then she turned it off and drove in silence, watching the landscape change in the headlights as the miles accumulated. The heat had been different in the city all week, drier and sharper than the ordinary summer heat. And as she moved south, she expected it to intensify the way the humidity usually did in that direction. It did not. Or rather, it intensified in a different register, dry and pressing rather than wet and enveloping. When she stopped for gas at the last town before Calverton, she noticed the grass at the edge of the parking lot was a color it should not have been in July, pale and brittle, more October than summer. She arrived at the property gate just after 9 in the last of the light. She pushed it open and drove in, parking where she usually did near the old cabin. She got out and stood for a moment listening. The sound was different. It took her a moment to identify the difference, and then she had it. The insects were quieter, not absent, but at a lower register, the thick, humid drone of a wet summer replaced by something thinner and more intermittent. She walked to the edge of where the wet ground usually began, the place where her boots had always sunk into the darker soil, and stopped. The water was gone. Not entirely, not everywhere. But where there had been standing water for every one of her previous visits, there was now bare ground, cracked in places into the small geometric shapes of dried earth, dark and rich with the material that had been under the water for years. The trees still stood in their formations, roots still raised in the same arching patterns, but the space between and around them had changed entirely. Ground that she had never seen or stood on was exposed now, stretching away from where she stood in every direction, irregular and dark and unfamiliar. She walked forward carefully, stepping onto the dried mud with the same testing caution she had always used on the soft, wet ground. It held her. The surface crackled faintly under her boots, thin and dried. The smell was different too, deeper and more complex, the smell of soil that had been underwater and had not yet decided what to become now that it was open to the air. She walked further in than she ever had, following the newly exposed ground between the tree roots, her flashlight cutting ahead of her in the darkening evening. The central ridge was still there, still running its straight and suspicious north-south line, but now she could see both sides of it clearly for the first time. And on the eastern side, where the water had been consistently deepest on her previous visits, the exposed ground told a story she had not expected. There were lines in the dried mud, straight lines, too deliberate to be natural, running perpendicular to the ridge at intervals she could not yet measure in the dark. She crouched and put her flashlight close to the ground, following one of the lines with the beam. It ran for 10, 15, 20 feet, then vanished under the edge of where the water still remained, still retreating. She stood and pointed the light along the ridge itself. And there, at a place she must have walked past a dozen times without understanding what she was seeing, she found what the drought had decided to give her. It was not much to look at. Not yet. Not in the dark with a flashlight and no context. It was a shape in the ground, a rectangle of slightly different color and texture in the dried mud, the dimensions of a large door laid flat against the earth. The edges were straight. The corners were clean. The surface within the rectangle was smoother than the ground around it, as if it had been covered by something other than soil for the years the water had been over it. Maggie knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the surface inside the rectangle. It was cool. Not the cool of soil or dried mud, but the cool of something else beneath. Something that did not give the way earth gives. Something solid. She stayed crouched there for a long moment, her hand pressed flat to the ground, the flashlight resting in the dried mud beside her, the dark of the swamp surrounding her on all sides. She thought of Harold Fitch's voice on the phone. She thought of Roland Pierce and his suit with the short sleeves and the way he had shaken her hand at a funeral 30 years ago. She thought of the ridge running perfectly straight through the property that was too straight to be natural, and the lines in the dried mud that were too regular to be accidental, and the old attorney who had said that the land had value not yet visible. Her hand pressed flat against the cool, solid surface beneath the dried mud. She picked up her flashlight. She stood. She walked back toward her car in the dark, carefully and without rushing, stepping between the tree roots the way she had learned to do over the months of walking this land. She had many questions. She had not been this close to answers before. She had learned, in the years of her life that had required it, how to move slowly when speed felt urgent. She had learned that the impulse to rush toward a thing was often the thing most worth resisting. She would not dig tonight. She would not call anyone tonight. She would sleep in the car if she had to, and she would wait for Harold Fitch's office to open in the morning, and she would go back to the ground in the daylight and understand, as much as she could, what the drought had uncovered before she told anyone else that it was there. She sat in the driver's seat of her car with the door open and the night air coming in and looked out toward the dark interior of the property. She could not see the ridge from here, but she knew where it was now in a different way than she had before. Not as a line on a sketch in a notebook, but as a real thing with mass and direction and purpose. The question was not yet what it was. The question was who had put it there and why they had needed the water to hide it. She did not sleep well in the car. The seat reclined only partially, and the night sounds of the property came through the cracked window in a continuous low register that was not unpleasant, but was not the sound of her bedroom either. She drifted in and out, waking each time the insects shifted pitch or a branch moved somewhere in the dark, and each time she woke she was aware immediately of the rectangle in the dried mud, the cool solid surface beneath her palm, the straight lines running perpendicular to the ridge. It occupied the place in her mind where worry usually lived, but it was not worry. It was something more specific and more electric, the sensation of standing at the edge of a question that was about to answer itself, whether she was ready or not. At 5:30, the sky began to pale in the east, and she gave up on sleep entirely. She got out of the car and stretched and walked to the edge of the old cabin, where a rusted standpipe still protruded from the ground at an angle. She had brought a water bottle, and she drank half of it and ate the granola bar she found in the bottom of her bag and watched the light come up over the property. The dawn changed everything. It always did. That was something she had learned on these visits, that the land read differently in morning light than it did at noon or at dusk, that each hour had its own quality of revelation. In the early light now, with the drought having pulled the water back and the ground exposed in ways it had not been in decades. The property looked like a place in the process of becoming legible. The tree lines were distinct. The ridge was visible from here as a long, gentle elevation running through the interior, its straightness unmistakable in the low-angled light that caught one side and left the other in shadow. She walked back in before the light was full, following the path she had taken the night before by memory and by the compression marks her boots had left in the dried mud. The property felt different in the morning, less enclosed, the canopy admitting more sky than she had perceived in the dark, the space between the trees more navigable. She moved without the flashlight, following the ridge from its northern end southward, keeping it on her left, watching the ground on the eastern side where the water had retreated furthest. The lines in the dried mud were clearer in the daylight. She counted 7 of them in the area she could see without the water still present, running east to west at intervals of roughly 20 feet. They were not deep, just slightly raised, subtle enough that she understood immediately why she had not found them before. Underwater, they would have been invisible. Even now, in dry conditions, they required a low angle of light to read, the kind of low morning light she was moving through. By noon, when the sun was overhead and the shadows were gone, they would flatten back into the surface and disappear into the general texture of the dried mud. She photographed everything. She had learned on her first few visits to document before she touched, and that habit served her now. She moved along the lines with her phone camera, keeping the angle low, letting the light do what it was doing. She photographed the rectangle in the center of the pattern, the place where the ground surface changed character. She photographed the ridge from the south end, looking north, then from the north end looking south. She photographed the way the lines related to the ridge, their perpendicular orientation, the regularity of their spacing. Then she crouched beside the rectangle and looked at it in the morning light without touching it. It was approximately 8 feet by 4 feet. The edges were clean and straight in a way that required, at minimum, a tool with a straight edge and a deliberate hand. The surface within the rectangle was smoother than the surrounding dried mud, almost polished in texture, and it caught the light slightly differently, a degree more reflective than the earth around it. She could see now, in the daylight, that the rectangle was not simply an area of different soil. It was a covering. The edges where the rectangle met the surrounding ground showed a faint gap, a hairline separation barely wide enough to slide a fingernail into, but present and consistent along all 4 sides. She did not try to open it. Not yet. She sat back on her heels and looked at the pattern of lines extending away from the rectangle in both directions and tried to think clearly about what she was looking at. The lines were structural. She was certain of that now. They were too regular and too consistent to be anything else. They ran east to west from the ridge across the eastern lowland, and they were spaced like supports beneath something, like the ribs of a floor running beneath a surface that was no longer visible, or like the supports beneath something that was still very much present, but had been underwater long enough that no one living had thought to look for it. Harold Fitch's office opened at 8:30. She was sitting in her car outside it at 8:15, her notebook in her lap, the photographs already organized on her phone. When his car pulled up at 8:27, she was standing on the sidewalk. He saw her and stopped. Something moved briefly in his expression, a recognition of something he had been expecting but had not been sure about the timing of. "You went last night," he said. "I did." "Come inside," he said. His office was exactly as she remembered it, unhurried and organized, full of morning light. He made coffee without asking whether she wanted any and set it in front of her and sat across the desk and looked at her with the patient attention of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular conversation. "Tell me what you found," he said. She described it methodically, the way she processed documents at the title company, beginning with the factual and building toward the interpretive. The retreated water, the exposed ground, the lines in the dried mud, the ridge and its unnatural straightness, the rectangle with its smooth surface and its hairline separation from the surrounding earth. She showed him the photographs in sequence. He looked at each one for longer than a glance required. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Roland showed me something years ago. He drove me out to the property in the middle of the afternoon and walked me into the interior, and he showed me the ridge. He didn't show me anything else, just the ridge. He said he had found it when he bought the land and that he had figured out what it was, but that it wasn't the right time yet." "What did he think it was?" Maggie asked. Fitch looked at her steadily. "He thought it was an old water management system," he said. "He thought the ridge was a constructed levee, man-made, very old. And he thought that the levee and the lines you're seeing in the mud were the remains of a larger installation that had been built on the property before the swamp was a swamp." Maggie looked at her coffee. "Before the swamp was a swamp," she repeated. "This area was not always wetland," Fitch said. "The county historical records, if you go back far enough, describe it as cultivated land in the 18th and early 19th century. Drained and farmed, at least in part. There were families here, settlements, small operations that were eventually abandoned as the water table rose and the land became less workable. By the time this parcel was surveyed in the modern era, it was already being classified as wetland." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "So whatever was built here was built before the water came up," she said. "That's what Roland believed. And he never found what was inside the rectangle." Fitch paused. He said he found the entry point once, very briefly, during a dry summer in the late 80s. He said the water had retreated enough that he could see it. He said he touched the surface and understood that it was a sealed chamber of some kind and that he was not equipped to investigate it properly. He looked at his coffee cup. He also said he was afraid, not of what was inside, of what it would become if the wrong people found it first. Maggie let that land. "So he kept the water over it," she said quietly. Fitch nodded slowly. "The land stayed wet most years. The swamp protected whatever was there. And Roland held onto the property, and he didn't talk about it. And eventually he got old." He looked up at her. "He chose you because you worked in property records. He thought you would understand land the way lawyers understand documents, which is to say, as a system of meaning that rewards patience." Maggie looked at her hands for a moment. She thought about the years of processing other people's deeds, the years of recording transfers and liens and easements, and the long, slow accumulation of knowledge about how land moved through time and who it belonged to and why. "I need to open that chamber," she said. "Yes," Fitch said. "You do. I need to do it carefully, and I need to do it with the right people present." "Also, yes," Fitch said. "I can help you with that." What followed was not fast because Maggie had decided that it would not be fast. She had a property in an active drought. She had what appeared to be a sealed underground structure on that property. She had a dead man's 60-year conviction that the land held something worth protecting. She had learned, in the months of walking the property, that the land rewarded patience and punished assumptions. She called into work on Monday and used 2 of her personal days. She called Mrs. Fontaine and extended the arrangement with the children through the week. She did not call Diane. She did not call her mother. She did not call the neighbor with the developer friend. Fitch had a contact, a woman named Dr. Audrey Solis, who worked in land and soil archaeology and consulted on historical site assessments across the southeastern region. He had used her on an estate matter years earlier involving a disputed colonial-era property boundary. He described her as thorough, discreet, and unimpressed by things that impressed other people, which Maggie took as high recommendation. Dr. Solis arrived Tuesday morning in a truck with a trailer carrying equipment that Maggie could not identify by name but recognized by function: instruments for measuring and recording and documenting, tools for careful excavation, a portable generator, sealed sample containers. She was somewhere in her mid-50s with short gray hair and the particular physical efficiency of someone who spent a great deal of time working in the field. She shook Maggie's hand and looked at the property through the gate for a moment before asking any questions. "Let me walk it first," she said, "before you show me anything specific. I want my own first impression." Maggie waited by the car, while Dr. Solis walked the property for 90 minutes. She came back with mud on her boots and her notebook half filled, in an expression that was harder to read than Maggie had hoped for. "How long have you owned this?" Dr. Solis asked. "About 4 months," Maggie said. "And before you?" "My great-uncle, from 1974. Dr. Solis looked back toward the interior of the property. The levee is deliberate construction, she said. 18th century or earlier, I would estimate from the composition alone. The lines you're seeing are structural remnants. The whole thing has been underwater for long enough that most people who looked at it saw a swamp and stopped. She paused. The rectangle you found. Show me. They walked in together. Dr. Solis moved slowly, stopping to take readings with instruments Maggie could not name, crouching at intervals to press her palm against the dried mud or to collect a small sample into a labeled container. She did not speak much. When they reached the rectangle, she crouched and looked at it for a long time without touching it. This is an access point, she said finally. To what? Maggie asked. Dr. Solis looked up. Something that was built to last, she said. Something that was sealed to be protected from water intrusion. The construction method I'm seeing at the edges, the material, the way the gap runs consistent around the perimeter, this is not accidental containment. Someone engineered this to hold against water pressure from above for an extended period. She paused. A very extended period. Maggie's heartbeat was doing something she was working to keep out of her voice. Can we open it? We can attempt access, Dr. Solis said. Carefully. There may be pressure differential if the chamber is genuinely sealed. There may be degraded atmosphere inside. We do this with the right precautions, and we document every step. The preparation took the rest of Tuesday. Dr. Solis established a working perimeter around the rectangle and the surrounding area. She took measurements and photographs from every angle. She ran a ground-penetrating radar unit along the lines in the dried mud, moving slowly and stopping to read the display at intervals. Maggie watched from the edge of the perimeter, saying nothing, allowing the process its own time. That evening, when the light was failing and Dr. Solis was packing her instrument for the night, she shared the radar readings with Maggie. They sat on the tailgate of the truck with the display between them, looking at the cross-section images of the ground. The chamber was real. The radar showed it clearly, a void beneath the rectangle, its dimensions precise and regular, approximately 8 feet by 20 feet by 6 feet in depth. Its walls returned the signal with a density that was not soil or natural material. The structural lines, extending away from it in both directions, showed as a grid of supports connecting to the levee, an engineering system that had once managed the water table across the eastern portion of the property, and which, in the current drought conditions, had partially re-exposed itself after what the radar stratigraphy suggested was somewhere between 150 and 200 years of submersion. Maggie looked at the image for a long time. 8 feet wide, 20 feet long, 6 feet deep, sealed, intact, and sitting on land that had been purchased for almost nothing in 1974 by an old man who had shaken her hand at a funeral and left her the only thing he had. What could be in it, she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Dr. Solis considered the question carefully. Given the construction period, the location, the method of sealing, and the fact that someone built an entire water management system, apparently in part to keep it submerged and protected, she said the possibilities range from mundane to significant. She paused. The effort involved argues against mundane. Wednesday morning arrived with the same dry heat as every morning that week, the drought holding steady across the region with no relief in the forecasts. Dr. Solis arrived before 7 with 2 additional people she had called in, a structural colleague named Marcus who specialized in historical construction materials, and a field assistant named Tomas who was young and methodical and who set up the equipment without being asked twice for anything. The opening of the access point took 3 hours, not because it was technically difficult, but because Dr. Solis refused to rush it. Every tool that touched the edge of the rectangle was documented. Every material that came away from the seam was collected, labeled, and set aside. The covering itself turned out to be a slab of dense, fired clay approximately 4 inches thick, sealed around its perimeter with a compound that Marcus identified as a historically consistent mix of lime and organic material that had been applied in multiple coats and had hardened over the years of submersion into something almost stone-like in its density. When the slab lifted, there was a sound. Not dramatic, not a hiss or a rush, but a soft exhalation, barely perceptible, the quiet release of an enclosed atmosphere meeting the open air after a long enclosure. Dr. Solis motioned everyone back and checked the air quality at the opening with a handheld monitor. She waited. She checked again. "We can proceed," she said. Maggie stood at the edge of the opening and looked down. The chamber was dark. Tomas handed her a light, and Dr. Solis positioned an additional lamp at the corner of the opening to flood the interior. Maggie looked in. The chamber was dry. That was the first thing, the most astonishing thing, that after all those years beneath the water table, the interior was dry. Dry in the way that things are dry when they have been sealed from moisture. Not the dryness of the open air, but the controlled dryness of a sealed environment. The air inside tasting faintly of something old and mineral when she breathed it from the edge of the opening. The floor of the chamber was smooth stone, set in flat pieces of the same fired clay as the covering slab. The walls were the same material, carefully joined, the seams filled with the same lime compound. The ceiling was low. She could tell perhaps 5.5 feet above the floor. And along the walls and floor of the chamber, arranged with a deliberateness that removed any remaining doubt about intention, were objects. She did not let herself move too fast. She stood at the opening for a full minute before she climbed down, and even then she moved to the edge of the floor and crouched and looked without touching. Dr. Solis was at her shoulder, the additional lamp flooding the space with clear white light. The objects along the left wall were wooden, large, rectangular. Chests, she thought, though that word felt inadequate once she was looking at them. There were 7 of them, stacked too high in some places, their surfaces dark with age and dry despite everything, their ironwork fastenings still present though oxidized to near black. Several had additional wrappings, treated cloth or oilskin, still partially intact in places, peeling away in others to reveal the wood beneath. Along the right wall were narrower objects, tall and cylindrical, wrapped in what had once been leather and tied with cord that had largely failed. Some had partially unwrapped and lay open, their contents partially visible. Ceramic vessels, metal implements, objects whose shapes suggested age and purpose, but whose specific nature she could not determine from where she stood. At the far end of the chamber, against the back wall, was something she had not expected, a writing surface, narrow and high like a standing desk, bolted to the wall. On its surface were paper documents, she thought at first, but Dr. Solis made a small sound beside her, and she looked more carefully. Not paper, something else. Treated skin, the kind used before paper became common, flat and preserved, and still holding its form after 2 centuries beneath the water. "Do not touch anything," Dr. Solis said quietly, to Maggie as much as to anyone. "Not yet. Not until we record everything in situ." Maggie straightened and stepped back. She was aware of her own breathing, of the quality of the air in the chamber, of the weight of the moment pressing against her in a way that she had not prepared for despite the months of preparation. She had expected the ground to hold something. She had not let herself imagine its scale. She climbed back out into the morning light and stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the trees and the dried mud and the sky above the canopy. Dr. Solis came up behind her. "You understand what this is?" Dr. Solis asked. "Tell me," Maggie said. "This is a pre-19th century storage installation," Dr. Solis said, and her voice had changed, carrying now the controlled excitement of someone in her field who had spent decades in pursuit of exactly this kind of thing. "The construction is consistent with late colonial period, possibly late 18th century, possibly older. The scale is significant. The preservation is extraordinary, attributable entirely to the sealed construction and the sustained water table above it." She paused. "Whoever built this wanted whatever is inside to last indefinitely. They succeeded." "What's in the chests?" Maggie asked. Dr. Solis looked at her carefully. "We don't know yet," she said. "But I can tell you that the iron fittings on those chests are consistent with the kind used on strong boxes and lockboxes of the period. And the way they were arranged, against the wall in a secured installation, sealed beneath a managed water system, suggests strongly that whoever placed them there considered the contents worth the extraordinary effort it took to protect them." Maggie looked at the opening in the ground. She thought about Roland Pierce in 1974 buying this land for the price of a used car. She thought about him standing in Harold Fitch's office and saying it had value not yet visible. She thought about a dry summer in the late 80s when the water retreated briefly and Roland touched the surface of the access slab and decided he was not equipped to proceed alone and that he was afraid of the wrong people finding it first. She thought about 60 years of mosquitoes and mud jokes. She thought about Diane. She thought about Eli and Bee and Mrs. Fontaine and the 2 pairs of heavy socks inside Priya's borrowed boots. She stood in the dry heat of the drought with her hands at her sides and breathed. How long will the documentation take? She asked. For something of this scope, done properly? Dr. Solis said. Several days, minimum, before we handle anything. A week before we know what we have with any confidence. Then we do it properly, Maggie said. The days that followed had the quality of suspended time, the way important things sometimes do. Dr. Solis and her team worked in the chamber in shifts, photographing and measuring and recording in meticulous sequence. Maggie remained at the property, sleeping in a motel in Calverton and driving out each morning before the heat reached its peak. She had called into work and taken the rest of the week. She had told her children she would be home by the weekend. She had not told them why she might be later than that. On the second day, Dr. Solis showed her the first set of detailed photographs from inside the chamber, spread on the tailgate of the truck in the long afternoon light. The iron-fitted chests were visible clearly now, and Marcus had done an initial examination of the exterior of 3 of them without opening any. His assessment was careful and specific. The construction was mid to late 18th century. The ironwork matched styles recorded in historical metalworking catalogs from the colonial American period. The sealing of the chests was original, meaning the fastenings had not been opened since they were closed. Since they were closed, Maggie said, the oxidation pattern on the fastening mechanisms is consistent and uninterrupted, Marcus said. If someone had opened and resealed these at any point after original closure, it would show in the metal surface history. It doesn't. He paused. These have not been opened since they were placed in that chamber. Maggie looked at the photographs. What's in them? Marcus and Dr. Solis exchanged a look that she was not meant to see, but did. We have a preliminary indication from the weight and acoustic testing, Dr. Solis said carefully. We did a non-invasive acoustic test on 2 of the chests this morning. The density of the response is consistent with metal, compacted, solid, and heavy. Maggie's hand was very still on the tailgate. Metal, she said. Gold and silver coin were the most common content of secured strong boxes of this period in this region, Marcus said. He said it the way you say a fact when a fact is the only responsible thing to offer. We don't know that's what this is. We won't know until we open them. When can we open them? Friday, Dr. Solis said. We complete in situ documentation Thursday. Friday morning, we can attempt access to the chests. Maggie nodded. That evening, she called Harold Fitch from the motel room and told him where they were in the process. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished, there was a silence on the line that she understood as the silence of a man absorbing something he had half expected for 30 years. Roland was right, Fitch said quietly. We don't know what's in them yet, Maggie said. No, Fitch said. But he was right about you. Friday arrived with the same thin, hot sky that had been over the county all week, the drought showing no signs of relenting, the water table still falling according to the monitoring instruments Dr. Solis had placed around the property perimeter. The recession of the water had continued to expose more of the structural lines in the dried mud, and Marcus had spent Thursday afternoon mapping their full extent, which covered substantially more of the eastern lowland than the area immediately around the chamber. He estimated the original installation had served a network of at least 12 to 15 acres of actively managed land, all of which was now swamp and had been swamp within living memory. The morning was quiet when they assembled at the chamber opening. Maggie, Dr. Solis, Marcus, Tomas, and Harold Fitch, who had driven out without being asked, arriving at 7:30 in his careful, unhurried way and standing slightly to the side, as if he understood that his role here was witness rather than participant. They lowered into the chamber carefully. The first chest was unlatched with tools sized to the period hardware, Marcus working with the focus of a man who understood what he was touching. The latch mechanisms were stiff with age and oxidation, but intact. They moved. The lid resisted and then gave, rising on leather hinges that had survived 2 centuries of seal preservation. The interior of the chest was lined with treated cloth, still largely intact, folded in layers over the contents. Marcus lifted the cloth carefully, folding it back in sections. The coins were gold. They were stacked in rows and columns with the precision of someone who had counted and arranged them deliberately, who had valued them enough to take time with how they were placed before the lid was closed for the last time. They caught the light from Tomas's lamp and threw it back, warm and immediate, as if they had been waiting 200 years for exactly this moment of exposure. Nobody spoke for a full 30 seconds. Then Dr. Solis said, in a voice that was almost entirely controlled, "We need to count." The count took the rest of the morning. 6 of the 7 chests contained coins, gold in 4 of them, silver in the remaining 2. The coins were predominantly Spanish colonial currency, which was not unusual for the period in this region, where Spanish reals circulated widely in trade and commerce, mixed with English colonial issues and a smaller number of French livres. Dr. Solis identified them by type and period as they were recorded, her knowledge moving efficiently across denominations and dates. The earliest were from the mid-17th century. The latest were from the early 19th. The range suggested accumulation over decades rather than a single deposit. The 7th chest contained documents, not coin. Paper documents in a preserving condition that Dr. Solis described as remarkable: land grants, property records, commercial accounts written in the formal hand of the period, their ink faded but legible, their content a record of transactions and holdings that had been sealed away with the same deliberateness as the coin. The cylindrical objects along the right wall were, as their partial unwrapping had suggested, a mixture of ceramic vessels and metal instruments. The ceramics, when the surviving wrappings were carefully removed, proved to be storage containers, several of them still sealed. Dr. Solis did not open them on sight. She documented their dimensions and exterior conditions and set them aside for laboratory examination. The metal instruments were navigational, she said. Compasses, a sextant, measuring devices of a period she placed consistent with the rest of the chamber's contents. They were wrapped in treated leather that had preserved them with a thoroughness that made Marcus shake his head quietly at the workmanship. The documents on the standing surface at the back wall were the last things recorded. They were land plats, hand-drawn, covering an area that corresponded, Dr. Solis said after examination, to several thousand acres of what was now Sutter County and the counties bordering it to the north and east. They were not deeds in the modern legal sense. They were records of surveyed holdings, the kind created before formal title systems, the kind that established prior claim to land in the period before the land itself was absorbed into the structures of government. Maggie sat with the chamber's inventory spread on the tailgate in the late afternoon. Dr. Solis stood beside her, and Harold Fitch stood on the other side, his hands in his coat pockets, his face composed. The preliminary coin count was 4,312 individual pieces, gold and silver. The coin alone, based on Dr. Solis's field assessment of period, condition, and rarity, carried a numismatic value entirely separate from its metal content. Rare coin of this period and provenance did not trade at spot metal price. It traded at multiples, sometimes large multiples, depending on the specific pieces and their condition. Dr. Solis had contacted, from the property, 2 colleagues in the field of historical numismatics. She had not told them where she was or why she was asking. She had described 2 specific pieces from the inventory and asked for an off-the-cuff valuation range. The range she received back was not something she repeated immediately in full. She said she would need formal appraisals before any number could be treated as reliable. "Give me a floor," Maggie said quietly. Dr. Solis looked at her for a moment. "The coin alone," she said. "Conservative, not accounting for the navigational instruments, the ceramics, the documents, or any of the other materials." She paused. The floor for the coin alone, conservatively, would be several $1,000,000, possibly significantly more. The specific pieces I described to my colleague, if my identification is correct, are of a rarity that affects the upper end of that range substantially. The dry heat of the afternoon pressed down on the property. The insects carried on in their reduced drought register. Somewhere in the interior of the swamp, a bird called and was answered. Harold Fitch exhaled slowly. It was almost inaudible. Almost. Maggie looked at the photographs of the open chests, the rows of coins catching the lamplight, arranged by someone 200 years ago with the careful hands of someone who knew exactly what they were placing and why it needed to last. She thought of the title company and the water glasses and the loan notices in the kitchen drawer. She thought of Eli asking the name of every tree and be saying it's really still, like it's thinking. She thought of Priya handing back the clean boots without a word of judgment. She thought of her mother saying 60 acres of swamp was more of a burden than a blessing, and Diane's voice on the phone delivering its verdict with the efficiency of someone who had never walked the land and therefore already knew exactly what it was worth. She looked at the coin in the photographs for a long time. She thought about Roland Pierce shaking her hand at a funeral, the short sleeves on the dark suit, the low conversation with her father near the back of the church, the things she had not known then and was only beginning to understand now, that he had been a man who found something and understood it and spent the rest of his life being patient enough to protect it for the right person to receive. He had known the water would come back most years. He had known that the land would look worthless to anyone who did not stay long enough to understand it. He had known that the wrong people would lose interest before the drought arrived to tell the truth. He had known she would walk it until she understood it. The sun was lower now, the light going amber across the dried mud of the exposed lowland, the ridge casting its long, straight shadow to the east, the entrance to the chamber covered temporarily with a protective tarp that Dr. Solis had secured at its corners. Maggie pressed her hands flat on the tailgate and stood up. "What I need to do next?" she asked. Dr. Solis and Harold Fitch both began to speak at the same time, and then both stopped. And then Fitch nodded at the archaeologist to go first, and Dr. Solis said, "Secure the site and authorize a full formal assessment. The objects need to move to a controlled environment for proper appraisal. Provenance will need to be established for the documents and the land plats. This is going to take time." "How much time?" Maggie asked. "Months, done properly," Dr. Solis said. "But the preliminary valuation, the formal assessment of the coin collection alone, that can begin within weeks." Maggie nodded. Fitch said, quietly, "You'll need legal counsel, proper representation, not just an old country attorney." "You're not old," Maggie said. He almost smiled. "I'm old enough," he said, "to know when something is larger than my usual practice. I'll stay involved, but you'll need specialists." Maggie looked at the tarp covering the entrance to the chamber. She looked at the dried mud and the structural lines and the straight shadow of the ridge. She looked at the property that had been 60 acres of swamp until it wasn't. "Okay," she said, "let's do this right." She called her children that evening from the motel room. Lying on the bed with her shoes off, the ceiling fan moving the warm air overhead in slow circles. Eli answered because he always answered first, already talking before the call had fully connected, already mid-sentence in whatever he had been thinking. She let him talk for a while about the friend's house, about a game they had played, about something he had said that morning that he considered worth reporting. She listened to his voice and felt something move through her that she did not have a precise word for. It was not relief. It was larger than relief. It was the sensation of a door that had been closed for years beginning, very slowly, to open from the inside. "Mom," Eli said, mid-sentence about something else. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here." She drove home Saturday morning. She did not call Diane. She did not call her mother. She drove with the windows down and the dry air coming through and the landscape moving past in the long, unhurried way it did when she was not in a hurry, when she had somewhere to go but was not afraid of what she would find when she got there. She had 60 acres of swamp, and in the dried mud at its center, 200 years of patience was waiting to be counted. The formal appraisal process began on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after the chamber was opened. By then, the drought had broken, partially, enough that the county to the north had lifted its emergency declaration while the one to the south maintained it. At the property in Calverton, the water table had begun its slow recovery, edging back toward the lowland from the east, reclaiming the dried mud in increments that Dr. Solis monitored with the same instruments she had used to document its retreat. The structural lines in the mud were disappearing again, covered first by a thin film of returning moisture and then by the first shallow layer of standing water. The swamp reasserting itself with the unhurried certainty of something that had been doing this for a very long time. The chamber itself had been properly excavated, documented, and stabilized in the weeks following discovery. A conservation team from a university 3 hours north had come down in the second week. 6 people in 2 vehicles with equipment that dwarfed what Dr. Solis had brought, and they had spent 4 days doing what Dr. Solis described as the kind of thorough site documentation that would hold up under any level of scrutiny later. Every object had been cataloged in situ before removal. Every surface had been photographed from multiple angles in multiple light conditions. The structural elements of the chamber had been assessed, measured, and recorded in drawings that Marcus produced by hand with a precision that Maggie found almost beautiful in its patience. The objects themselves had been transported to a climate-control facility affiliated with the university, where they were now in the care of specialists whose particular expertise covered the period and provenance of what had been found. The coin collection had gone to a numismatist named Dr. Elaine Vorhaus, who was considered, according to Dr. Solis, one of the foremost authorities on colonial-era currency in the southeastern United States. The documents had gone to a historian of the same period. The ceramics and navigational instruments had gone to their own respective specialists. It was a dispersal that felt, to Maggie, like watching something she had just found be handed to a series of strangers. But she understood the necessity of it and trusted Dr. Solis's choices in a way she had not trusted many people's judgment in recent years. She had also hired the attorney. Not the one Fitch had recommended first, but the one that attorney had recommended after hearing the scope of the matter. A woman named Patricia Osei who practiced in the city and whose office occupied a floor of a building downtown that Maggie had passed on the bus to work for 4 years without ever expecting to enter. Patricia Osei had the quality of someone who had heard large numbers before and was not going to be moved off center by them, which was exactly what Maggie needed. Their first meeting had lasted 3 hours and covered legal frameworks, potential tax implications, the status of the historical land plats, and the question of how the discovery would eventually be characterized for purposes of ownership and valuation. Osei had asked, near the end of that meeting, whether Maggie intended to go public with the discovery before the appraisal was complete. Maggie had said no. Osei had nodded once, the nod of someone who considered that the correct answer. So the weeks of the appraisal passed in a particular kind of silence that Maggie found easier to bear than she had expected. She went back to work at the title company. She went back to the restaurant 3 evenings a week. She made school lunches and checked homework and attended a parent-teacher conference for Eli in which his teacher described him as enthusiastic, which was the teacher's word for something that required occasional redirection. She paid the electric bill. She deposited a check from the children's father that arrived without note or explanation and covered approximately 2 weeks of groceries. She told Priya everything because Priya had earned it and because Maggie needed one person outside the professional circle to know, one person who would respond to the information as a human rather than as a specialist or an advisor. Priya listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something Priya was good at, and then sat for a moment in the particular quality of silence that follows the end of a very long story. "How do you feel?" Priya asked. Maggie thought about it honestly. "Like I'm waiting for someone to tell me it isn't real," she said. Priya nodded. "And if it is real, then I have to figure out how to be a different kind of person than I've been," Maggie said, "without losing the parts of the person I've been that I actually want to keep." Priya looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be fine," she said, not in the way people said it to fill silence, but in the specific way of someone who had watched another person closely for a long time and was reporting what they saw. The preliminary appraisal results came from Dr. Vorhaus in October. They arrived as a document, not a phone call, 41 pages of analysis covering the coin collection in its entirety, each piece cataloged with period, mint, denomination, condition grade, and estimated value range. The document was dense with the specific language of numismatic scholarship, references to comparable sales at auction, to rarity classifications, to the particular premium that attached to coins of documented provenance from a sealed colonial-era context, rather than coins of uncertain history moving through the general market. Maggie read it twice in Patricia Osei's office, sitting across the desk from Osei, who waited with the patience of a person who billed by the hour and was not uncomfortable with silence. On the second reading, Maggie focused on the summary section at the end, which distilled the 41 pages into 3 paragraphs. The third paragraph contained the aggregate valuation range. She looked at the number for a long time. She looked up at Osei. "Is this right?" she said. Not in disbelief exactly. In the way that you ask a question when you already know the answer, but need to hear it confirmed by someone whose job is to be precise. Dr. Vorhaus is conservative in her valuations, Osei said. She establishes a floor and a ceiling. The floor is what she would guarantee in a controlled auction today with the documentation that exists. The ceiling represents what comparable pieces have achieved in recent years at major houses. Osei paused. The coin collection alone, at the floor valuation, is $14 million. At the ceiling, based on the rarity classification of the specific pieces she has identified as exceptional, the upper range is between 30 and 38 million. The office was very quiet. That is the coin collection alone, Osei continued, her voice unhurried. Before the ceramic vessels, which are an assessment. Before the navigational instruments, which are an assessment. Before the historical documents and land plats, which are being evaluated by 2 separate historians and a real property attorney who specializes in colonial-era claim analysis. She set her pen down on the desk. The land plats are potentially the most complex element of this entire matter, and their value is not yet something anyone is able to quantify. What I can tell you is that the historian working on them has already contacted me twice to say that what Maggie's property contains is, in her words, the most significant private discovery of colonial land documentation in this region in the last 50 years. Maggie placed both hands flat on the desk the way she had placed her palm flat against the surface of the access slab in the dark of the swamp, grounding herself in something solid. "What do I do now?" she said. "Now," Osei said, "we proceed carefully, we complete the full appraisal, and then we make considered decisions about what to sell, what to retain, and how to structure whatever comes next." The news broke in November, not through Maggie and not through anyone in the professional circle. It broke through a county records request that a journalist had filed as part of a broader story on drought-related land changes in the region. The records included the permits Dr. Solis's team had filed during the site stabilization, which were public documents, and the journalist was sharp enough to read between the lines of their technical language and make a call to the university's conservation department, where someone junior and unguarded had confirmed more than they should have. The story that appeared online on a Wednesday morning was incomplete and factually imprecise in several of its specifics, but it had the essential shape of the truth. Swampland inherited by a single mother found to contain colonial-era cash. Preliminary appraisals in the millions. Archaeologists involved. The property described with its county and acreage. Osei called Maggie at 7 that morning. "It's out," she said. "We manage it now rather than react to it." The reaction was faster and larger than Maggie had anticipated, which was itself something she noted, that she had failed to fully imagine the scale of other people's interest in a story like this. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional outlets. By evening, it had reached national ones. By the following morning, there were 3 television vans on the county road outside the property gate. Maggie was not at the property. She was at the title company, processing a deed transfer for a house on the north side of the city, her hands doing their familiar work while her phone vibrated steadily in her bag. She finished the transfer, filed it correctly, and then went to the break room and sat down with a cup of coffee and turned her phone over. 47 missed calls. Diana called 6 times. Her mother had called 4 times. Gary had called twice. There were numbers she did not recognize, journalists she assumed. There was a text from Priya that said simply, "Saw it. How are you?" She called Priya back first. "I'm okay," she said. "Do you need anything?" "I need people to stop calling me," she said. "That's not going to happen today," Priya said. "No," Maggie agreed. "Probably not today." She called Osei next, then Dr. Solis, then Harold Fitch. She made plans. She authorized a brief statement to be released through Osei's office that confirmed the discovery in general terms, stated that a full appraisal was in progress, and declined to provide further comment pending its completion. The statement was released at 3 in the afternoon and immediately did what statements of that kind always do, which is to answer no questions while confirming that there were questions to be answered, which generated more interest rather than less. She did not call Diane or her mother that day. She did not call them the following day either. She called her children. She told them, simply and without drama, that some people might say things about their family at school, and that if anything was confusing or uncomfortable, they should come to her directly. Eli wanted to know why people were saying things. She told him that she had found something valuable on the land she had inherited from her great-uncle, and that it was going to take some time to sort out. He asked how valuable. She said very. He was quiet for a moment, and then asked whether this meant they could get a dog. She laughed for the first time in several days. "We'll talk about it," she said. Diane called on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after the story broke. By then, the full scope of the discovery had entered the public record through the appraisal releases that Osei had authorized in stages, each one building on the last as the specialist assessments were completed and could be accurately represented. The coin collection's preliminary floor valuation had been reported. The historical significance of the documents had been covered in a long article by a journalist who had actually done the research and spoken to the historians involved. The total picture that had emerged in the public conversation was still incomplete, still subject to revision as the full appraisal continued, but it was no longer possible to look at the number being discussed and arrive at the word swamp as a conclusion. Diane's voice on the phone was different, not unrecognizable, still Diane, still organized and direct, but carrying something underneath the organization that Maggie could hear clearly. It was the sound of someone who had been certain of something and had discovered, in the most public way possible, that they had been wrong. "I should have come with you," Diane said. It was not an apology. It was closer to a statement of regret, which from Diane was a significant movement. "You were being practical," Maggie said. "Not defensively, just as a fact." "I was being dismissive," Diane said. There was a pause. "I'm glad it worked out." "Thank you," Maggie said. "Gary wants to know if you need any investment advice," Diane said, and then, unexpectedly, laughed. A short, self-aware sound that Maggie had not heard from her in years. Maggie smiled. "I have people for that," she said. Her mother called the same week. The conversation was shorter and less self-aware, but arrived at the same essential destination. Her mother said she had always known Roland had something up his sleeve, which was now retrospectively a compliment, and that she was very proud of Maggie for being brave enough to take the risk. Maggie did not correct the timeline or the characterization. She thanked her mother and asked how her book club was going. The developer's friend her neighbor had mentioned called, through channels now, properly routed to Osei's office. His offer, Osei reported with a neutral expression, was for the land itself, not the contents, which are no longer attached to the land in a legal sense, but the property, which he was now characterizing as a site of historical significance that would benefit from professional development. His offer was 17 times what Maggie had been told the land was worth the first time anyone quoted her a number. Osei had recommended declining. Maggie had already decided to decline before Osei finished the sentence. The land was not for sale. This was a decision she had made quietly, almost without recognizing it as a decision, somewhere in the weeks of the appraisal process. The swamp had been Roland's, and now it was hers, and its value was not separable from its nature in a way that allowed for development. The drought had revealed what was under the water, but the water was the reason it had survived. The land had protected its own secret for 2 centuries. She was not going to thank it by turning it into something else. What she was going to do with it was a different question, and one she was still answering. Dr. Solis had suggested, on more than one occasion, that the site warranted permanent conservation status, that the structural remains of the water management installation alone were of sufficient historical significance to merit protection and study. The university's conservation department had expressed formal interest in a long-term research partnership. Harold Fitch had mentioned, carefully and without pressure, that Roland had once said he hoped the land would eventually be understood properly. Maggie had said she would think about it. She was thinking about it. The full appraisal was completed in February. Osei's office held a meeting in the large conference room on the floor of the downtown building that Maggie had passed on the bus for 4 years. Dr. Solis was present. Dr. Voorhouse participated by telephone. The historian who had been working on the documents, a woman named Dr. Catherine Marsh, was there in person, and she had the particular quality of someone whose academic composure was working hard to contain a genuine and sustained excitement about what she had been looking at for the past several months. The final numbers were presented in a document that Osei had prepared with the same clarity she brought to everything. Maggie read it at the conference table while the others waited. The coin collection, fully appraised, with provenance documentation, ranged from $22 million at the conservative floor to $39 million at the premium ceiling, the upper figure driven by the specific rarity classifications of 31 individual pieces that Dr. Voorhouse had identified as among the finest known examples of their type in private hands. The ceramic vessels, once opened and assessed, had proved to contain additional materials, a portion of them jewelry items of the period, gold and gem set pieces consistent with the coin collection's implied ownership profile, their value assessed separately at between $4 and $7 million. The navigational instruments were assessed at a lower individual value, but carried additional significance as a complete set of the period, and several institutions had already expressed acquisition interest. The aggregate assessment was between $800,000 and $1.2 million. The historical documents were the element Dr. Marsh had called to discuss personally. She spoke carefully, aware of the legal and financial dimensions of what she was saying alongside the historical ones. The documents were authentic, fully attributable to the late 18th century, and represented a private archive of commercial and property records from a trading family of the period whose known records had previously been considered almost entirely lost. Their historical significance was, in her assessment, extraordinary. Their monetary value was harder to establish precisely because there was no clean market comparison for what they were, but the institutional acquisition interest that had already formed around the preliminary reports suggested a range between $3 and $8 million for the archive as a whole, with the possibility that specific elements might exceed that depending on how they were handled. The land plats were the most complex element. Dr. Marsh and the real property attorney working with her had spent considerable time establishing what the plats represented and what legal standing, if any, they might carry in the current framework. The conclusion was that they carried no actionable legal claim to the land they depicted, too much time and too many intervening transfers for that, but that they were of extraordinary historical value as documentation of pre-title land organization in the region, and that 2 major institutions had already expressed acquisition interest at figures Dr. Marsh characterized as significant. Maggie looked at the total range at the bottom of Osei's document. The conservative aggregate across all categories was $31 million. The ceiling, dependent on how specific items were handled and what acquisition opportunities materialized, was between $55 and $60 million. She set the document flat on the conference table. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary way. Buses and pedestrians, and the particular light of a February morning that was gray and mild and entirely indifferent to what was happening on this floor of this building. Maggie thought about the kitchen sink and the softened cereal. She thought about the 2 pairs of heavy socks in Priya's borrowed boots. She thought about the electric bill in the drawer and the school lunch fees and the particular mathematics of a life run on 2 jobs and a father who sent money sometimes. She thought about the moment her palm touched the cool solid surface beneath the dried mud of the swamp floor, in the dark, with the flashlight resting in the mud beside her and the sound of insects at a distance, and nothing but the evidence of her own senses telling her something was there. She thought about staying. That was what it had come down to in the end. Everyone else had looked at the land and made their assessment from the outside. Diane on the phone, Gary with his professional experience, her mother with her maxims, the developer with his offer. They had all done the calculation from the outside and arrived at swamp as an answer. The only variable that had produced a different result was staying, walking it until it told her what it was. She looked up from the document at the people around the table. Dr. Solis, who had driven out on a morning's notice because a lawyer called and stayed a week because the ground turned out to be worth staying for. Dr. Vorhaus on the telephone, who had spent 4 months in the careful company of coins that had been waiting 200 years for someone to count them correctly. Harold Fitch, who had kept a dead man's faith in a swamp for 30 years and had called her when the water retreated because he had always believed she would come. She felt the weight of what she was going to say before she said it, not because it was heavy in a bad way, but because it was real, because it was the first time she had said it to anyone other than herself, and saying it out loud would make it the shape of the next part of her life. I want to keep the land in the family, she said. I want to pursue the conservation designation with the university. I want the objects handled in a way that serves their historical significance, which means I'm open to institutional acquisition for the elements where that's the right outcome. And I want the financial proceeds managed in a way that is stable enough for my children's futures and honest enough that I can explain it to them when they're old enough to understand it. Osei looked at her across the table. That is exactly what we are here to help you do, she said. Spring came to the property in Calverton the way it always had, without announcement. The light shifting and the water rising back into the lowland, and the birds returning in their sequences, and the heavy green of the cypress and oak canopy deepening against the pale new sky. Maggie drove down in March with both children. The water was higher than it had been in September, but still below the pre-drought level, and enough of the structural lines in the eastern lowland remained visible to show Eli what she had been looking at when the ground gave up its secret. He crouched at the edge of one of the lines and traced it with his finger and asked, at approximately the speed of someone who had been saving, questions: how old it was, and who built it, and why, and whether there were other places in the world where things like this were hidden underwater, and whether the people who built it knew it would last this long, and whether they would be surprised to know it was still there. Maggie answered what she could and said, "I don't know," for the rest, which was the true answer and which she had learned to give without apology. Bee stood at the edge of the access point, which had been properly covered with a weatherproof seal by the conservation team, and was marked now with a small, plain placard giving the site's survey designation. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at Maggie. "This is ours," Bee said. She did not mean it as a possessive statement. She meant it the way she had meant the water is really still, like it's thinking. She meant it as an observation about something that was true. "Yes," Maggie said. They walked the ridge together, all three of them, Maggie in the middle with one child on each side, the straightness of the levee visible in both directions, running its improbable north-south line through the interior of 60 acres that had been purchased for almost nothing by an old man in a short-sleeved suit and kept wet and private and patient through 50 years of silence until the right drought and the right person arrived at the same time. Harold Fitch met them at the property gate on their way out. He had driven over without being summoned, which was becoming a pattern that Maggie recognized as the way he expressed things he could not easily say in the direct language of a man trained in legal precision. He shook her hand, the same handshake she had received in his office months ago, and then, unexpectedly, crouched down and shook both children's hands as well. Eli was delighted by this. Bee accepted it with the gravity she brought to things she considered significant. Fitch straightened and looked out over the gate toward the interior of the property. "Roland would have been pleased," he said. Maggie stood beside him looking at the same thing, the gate, the track, the trees beyond it, the deep ordinary green of a place that looked like nothing much to people who had not walked it. "I think he planned it," she said. Fitch nodded slowly. "I think he did," he said. "I think he planned most of it from the moment he bought it. He just needed the right conditions." He paused. "Drought and patience. And someone who would stay," Maggie said. "And someone who would stay," Fitch agreed. She drove north with the windows down and the children in the back seat. Eli asleep against the door within 30 miles of Calverton, Bee watching the landscape pass with her particular watchful attention. The road moved through the same country it always moved through, the fields and the tree lines and the smaller towns, and then the outer rings of the city, and then the city itself. The money was real. That was something she was still learning to hold as a fact rather than a possibility. Patricia Osei had structured the first distribution in a way that covered the immediate practical needs without fanfare and without waste. The debt cleared, the children's education funds established, the two jobs reconfigured into a choice rather than a necessity. Maggie had kept the job at the title company for 3 months after the first distribution, partly because she genuinely liked processing property records, and partly because she needed the continuity of familiar work while the larger changes settled into her life. She had eventually reduced her hours rather than leaving entirely. There was something in the work that she was not ready to give up yet, the daily contact with the documents of how land moved through time and who it belonged to and why. The restaurant job she had let go at the end of January. Her feet had been grateful for 2 consecutive weeks before she even noticed the absence of the schedule. She had not moved. Not yet. And perhaps not for a while. The apartment was the children's home, and she was not in a hurry to change the ground under their feet before they were ready. There were practical improvements, things she had simply not been able to address before that were now addressed. The car replaced, the roof leak that the landlord had been promising to fix for 2 years now fixed at her own expense without argument, new boots for both children as the weather turned, a dentist appointment for herself that she had been postponing for a year. Small things. The daily texture of a life where the margin was no longer calculated to the nearest $10. She thought about what Priya had asked in the break room that first week, before the appraisal was complete, and before the story had broken, and before any of the numbers were real. "How are you?" She had said she felt like she was waiting for someone to tell her it wasn't real. She knew now that it was real. Not because of the appraisal documents, or the figures in the Osei's presentation, or the institutional letters of acquisition interest that arrived in the mail. Real in the simpler and more durable way of things that had changed the fundamental condition of a life. She had been a person running a capacity with no margin and no room to stop and think and choose. She was becoming a person who had those things. The transition was not instantaneous, and it was not without its own disorientation, the way that eyes that have been in the dark for a long time need time to adjust to light without pain. But it was real. She had driven 60 acres of swamp to its answer. She had stayed when everyone who knew better had told her to go. She had placed her palm flat on the ground in the dark and felt something solid and had not flinched from it. She thought about what Roland Pierce had said to Fitch over 30 years of occasional conversation. That it had value not yet visible. He had meant the land. He had also, she suspected, meant her. He had looked at a girl of 9 or 10 at a funeral in whatever particular way old people with long patience look at young people they are quietly assessing, and he had decided that she was worth a long bet, worth the 50-year accumulation of silence and mosquitoes and low purchase price and everyone's confident knowledge that the swamp was worthless. She had not known she was carrying his faith. She had not known she was the answer to a question he had been holding for decades. She had just gone to the land because she had been handed it and because she was not the kind of person who let go of things before she understood them, which was a quality that had made her life harder in some ways and which had turned out, in the end, to be exactly the right quality for the land she had been given. The city rose around the highway as she came into it from the south. The apartment, the school, the title company, the neighborhood where she had been running at capacity for years in the particular silence of a person who had stopped announcing. How hard things were, because announcing it changed nothing. It was different now. Not everything. She was still herself, which meant she was still careful and still slow to trust and still inclined to work through things quietly before sharing them. She still made coffee in the morning and stood by the kitchen window and looked out at the world before it asked anything of her. She still paid attention to details, to the quality of light, to the patterns in things that other people walked past without seeing. She still moved slowly toward conclusions rather than arriving at them first and looking for evidence second, which was the error that had cost everyone around her the ability to see what the swamp was. But the weight that had been the constant background condition of everything the particular exhaustion of a life with no margin and no room, that was lifting, not all at once. Gradually, the way water rose back into a lowland after a drought, filling the low places first, and then the middle ground, and then the edges, until the surface was continuous again, and the things that had been exposed in the dry time were covered once more, held safe beneath the quiet, still water. He said from the back seat, without preamble, "I want to go back." "We'll go back," Maggie said. "To stay?" Maggie thought about this. The property, the conservation research partnership with the university, the question of what the land wanted to be next, the cabin that could be rebuilt, the ridge that ran its straight, patient line through the interior, the water that covered the sealed foundation of something 200 years old and would cover it again and would keep it safe as it always had. "Maybe someday," she said. He considered this and appeared to accept it. They pulled into the parking lot of the apartment building as the last of the afternoon light was going. Eli woke when the car stopped, surfacing from sleep in his sudden way, already talking, already asking what was for dinner, already 2 steps ahead of the moment he was in. Maggie watched him climb out of the car and stretch his arms wide against the sky, a gesture of complete and unself-conscious physical gladness, and felt the thing in her chest that she still did not have a precise word for. It was not relief. It was larger than relief. It was the sensation of arriving somewhere that had been waiting for you, not with impatience, but with the long, unhurried certainty of a place that knew you would come eventually and had kept the light on in the way that places do when they have been waiting, when everything that was meant to happen was simply waiting for the right person to stay long enough to find it. She locked the car and walked toward the building with one child on each side. She had 60 acres of swamp, and she was exactly the right person to know what that meant. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.